Look closely at this royal portrait. A crown, a scepter, the heir to the richest empire on earth. But behind the velvet and gold is a horror story written into his very bones. Spain's King Charles II wasn't cursed by witches, he was cursed by his own family tree. And when the Hapsburgs married each other for 200 years, they didn't just destroy a dynasty, they created a living medical nightmare. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire collapsed from inside its own blood. Section 1. The royal palace of Madrid in the winter of 1661 was thick with incense and whispers. Outside, the streets echoed with the bells of celebration. Spain had a new heir. But inside the dim, suffocating chamber where Queen Mariana lay exhausted, the mood was anything but triumphant. The baby had arrived screaming, but the sound quickly fell into labored, rasping gasps. The midwives exchanged troubled glances as they swaddled the infant. His skull looked swollen, too large for his frail body. His lips refused to seal, his jaw unnaturally thrust forward. When they finally placed him into his mother's arms, Mariana recoiled ever so slightly before regaining her composure. She was no stranger to malformed children. Half her siblings had died before their 10th birthdays. But this child was not merely fragile. He looked unfinished. "Is this, God forgive me, the Prince of Spain?" one midwife whispered when she thought no one could hear. A physician cleared his throat and forced a courtly smile. "His Majesty has been blessed with vigor, though his frame is delicate. With care, he will thrive." Mariana said nothing. Her eyes traced the boy's protruding jaw, the slack tongue that lolled out of his mouth. In her heart she knew what the others dared not admit. This child bore the unmistakable stamp of Hapsburg blood, too much Hapsburg blood. For centuries, her dynasty had prided itself on its motto, Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nub. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It had been a policy as dangerous as any battlefield, for it meant cousins wedding cousins, uncles taking nieces as wives, bloodlines folding in upon themselves until the family tree resembled more of a twisted circle than a living oak. The Spanish branch had taken the practice to extremes. By the time Charles came into the world, all 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same original pair, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. Generations of narrowed blood had culminated in this moment, in this newborn who gasped for air as if already weary of life. The heralds announced to Madrid that Spain had an heir. Fireworks cracked in the distance. But inside the royal chamber, silence pressed heavy on the walls. The queen closed her eyes, refusing to look at her child again that night. Little did they know, this fragile boy would grow into a king remembered not for his power, but for the grotesque testimony his body would provide, a living record of how a dynasty could undo itself through its own obsession with purity. Section 2. The palace chroniclers recorded the birth with formality, ink pressed onto parchment in flowing script. On the 6th day of November, the Lord delivered unto Spain a son, Don Carlos, heir to the throne. The words dripped with triumph, but the truth lingered behind closed doors. From the first days, Charles's frailty baffled the physicians. He rarely cried, and when he did, the sound was thin and weak, like a wheeze escaping a cracked flute. He struggled to feed, unable to suckle with strength. A wet nurse, one of many brought in to care for him, confessed to another servant that the infant suckles as though the breast were poison, his tongue too large, his lips unable to hold. Whispers began to circulate in the shadowed halls. Servants crossed themselves when they passed the royal nursery. Some muttered that the child was bewitched, a cruel gift from God for the sins of his ancestors. Others said nothing but averted their eyes, for it was not wise to speak ill of the king's heir. Philip IV, Charles's father, visited the chamber once, standing tall in his elaborate robes. His face, proud but weary, betrayed nothing. He looked upon the child swaddled in silk, observed his lolling tongue and trembling limbs, and after a brief silence, turned away. "The boy will grow," he said flatly. "God favors Spain." He left without touching his son. Mariana, meanwhile, felt the weight of her dual role, both mother and, in a twisted knot of Hapsburg lineage, aunt and cousin to her own child. Her guilt was private, unspoken, yet it grew each time she saw the nurses struggle to feed him, each time she caught sight of his disproportionate skull resting too heavily upon a tiny body. Years earlier, diplomats had praised the Hapsburg practice of strategic marriage. It had united kingdoms, secured treaties, and forged the most formidable empire in Europe. But in the nursery, in the fragile body of little Charles, the cost of centuries of such unions revealed itself. By his second year, it was obvious Charles was no ordinary child. He had yet to crawl, his limbs thin as reeds. Servants carried him from one room to another, as if he were a porcelain doll. His head, so large, so heavy, seemed always in danger of toppling from his neck. His eyes were watery, his skin pale as candle wax. At night, when the palace quieted and the torches burned low, Mariana sometimes stood beside his cradle, watching him sleep. She whispered prayers into the darkness, her words wavering. "Holy Virgin, grant my son strength. Do not let him be the last of our line." But heaven was silent. The boy stirred, drooled down his chin, and slept on. What neither Mariana nor Philip could admit, at least not yet, was that Spain's future, the mighty empire stretched across continents, rested in the trembling hands of a child who could barely hold his own head upright. Section 3. By the time Charles reached his 4th birthday, the truth could no longer be hidden. The bells of Madrid rang to celebrate the young prince, but inside the palace, his attendants whispered in dread. Other children ran and played. Charles did not. His legs were too weak, his bones too soft, curving unnaturally beneath his tiny frame. He was carried everywhere, up staircases, into gardens, even from bed to chair. A wooden contraption had been built to support him, padded with velvet so his fragile body would not bruise. Whenever he was paraded before the court, 2 servants discreetly held him upright, their arms hidden beneath heavy robes. The courtiers clapped politely, bowing as the child waved with a limp wrist. But behind the painted fans and forced smiles, their eyes filled with unease. Spain's empire, its colonies, its gold, its armies, rested upon this boy who could not walk on his own. Worse still, Charles could not speak. Not properly. His mouth hung open constantly, drool glistening on his chin. When he tried to form words, the sound was wet and garbled, his swollen tongue pushing against that jutted jaw. His mother understood him best, though even she admitted privately. It is as though he speaks another tongue, one known only to angels or demons. In the evenings, tutors attempted lessons. One of them, a stern Jesuit named Father Diego, bent over the boy's table with quill and parchment. "Repeat after me, Your Highness," Diego urged, drawing the letters A, B, C in thick black ink. Charles stared at the shapes. His lips moved, but what came out was a slurry of sounds, incomprehensible. Drool spotted the parchment. The tutor wiped it away quickly, murmuring, "Good, very good, my prince. We will try again tomorrow." He bowed low, hiding the despair in his eyes. At court gatherings, foreign ambassadors began to notice. A French diplomat, writing to his king, confessed, "The young prince is peculiar. His visage is unsettling, his jaw protruding so far that he resembles a grotesque mask. He does not walk, he scarcely speaks. I fear for Spain's future." Mariana read such reports and burned them, though their words echoed in her mind. She sought comfort in prayer, kneeling for hours in the chapel, whispering for a miracle that would not come. Still, the court clung to denial. "The boy is slow to grow," physicians insisted. "But many princes are late bloomers. Time will bring strength." But time brought only more shadows. Section 4. Illness became Charles's constant companion. By 6 years old, his body was already a battlefield. Fevers came like waves, rolling in without warning and leaving him weaker each time. When measles struck, the boy lay pale and shivering, red blotches spreading across his fragile skin. His attendants whispered prayers at his bedside, crossing themselves whenever his breathing turned shallow. He survived, but survival meant scars. Not long after, chickenpox swept through the palace. Again Charles was bedridden, his face pocked and raw. He cried weakly, unable to scratch at the itching sores, his arms too frail to lift. The nurses tied soft cloth around his hands to keep him from clawing his own skin. When the fever broke, new scars joined the old, marring what little softness his features once held. Then came smallpox. For weeks the prince teetered between life and death. His swollen head lolled on the pillow, his eyes rolled back, his lips cracked and bleeding. The court physicians, 6 of the most celebrated men in Spain, took turns at his bedside, leeches and poultices at the ready. "He cannot last," one muttered to another when they thought no one was listening. But Charles did last. Somehow, impossibly, he clung to life. Yet each recovery left him more diminished, as if each disease had stolen a piece of him that would never return. His immune system, crippled by his twisted genes, welcomed every sickness like an open door. By 9, the damage was obvious. His skull seemed larger still, stretched by what physicians described in hushed tones as water upon the brain. The boy complained of splitting headaches, clutching his temples, whimpering through the night until he exhausted himself into fitful sleep. Then came the fits. Seizures, sudden and violent. Servants would hear a thud and find the prince on the floor, his small body jerking uncontrollably, foam at the corners of his mouth. Afterward, he lay motionless, his breathing ragged, his eyes vacant as though he were staring at something only he could see. It terrified the court. Some whispered of witchcraft, others of divine punishment. Mariana's ladies-in-waiting crossed themselves whenever Charles passed, muttering that the child was bewitched. Soon, the nickname began to spread, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But what unsettled the court most wasn't his sickness, it was his mind. Tutors reported that the boy struggled to retain even the simplest lessons. He forgot prayers taught to him the day before. He lost focus during readings, staring blankly at the wall until someone shook him back to attention. "His Majesty listens, but it does not remain," one tutor confessed in a private note. "It is as if knowledge slips through his fingers like water." The empire's future, gold from the Americas, fleets in the Mediterranean, the crown of Spain itself, balanced on this fragile child who could not master his own alphabet. Section 5. As the years passed, it became painfully clear that Charles would never grow into the man his empire required. By the time he should have been stepping into adolescence, the transformation never came. Other princes at court sprouted into lanky teenagers, their voices deepening, their faces marked by the first signs of manhood. Charles, however, remained trapped in a child's body. His voice was high and thin, his frame slight and bent. No beard sprouted upon his cheeks, no broadening of shoulders, no strength of limb. He remained small, weak, and oddly delicate, as though time itself refused to carry him forward. The physicians held anxious conferences, whispering in corners of the palace. "The glands are at fault," one declared. "The boy produces no vigor, no heat of manhood." But they dared not write such words in official reports. To admit openly that Spain's heir could not mature was to admit that the line itself might end with him. Mariana noticed it first in the private chambers. Charles had no interest in flirtations, no blush at the sight of a lady-in-waiting, no restless energy of adolescence. He seemed locked in a strange limbo, more boy than man, his mind still childlike even as the years slipped away. At 14, he still struggled with basic reading. At 15, he had yet to mount a horse without assistance. At 16, his tutors abandoned Latin entirely, declaring it useless to push further. "He cannot grasp it," one said bluntly. "We must be content with his prayers." And yet, despite his obvious fragility, the court began to whisper of marriage. Spain needed an heir. The empire demanded continuity. Whether Charles was ready or not, whether he was capable or not, the machinery of politics could not wait forever. At 17, plans were set in motion. Letters were exchanged across Europe, searching for a bride strong enough to bear children and willing enough to marry a man whose frailty was already legend. France sent a candidate, the radiant Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of the powerful Louis XIV. When the French princess arrived in Madrid, the contrast between bride and groom stunned all who witnessed it. Marie-Louise was young, graceful, glowing with health. Charles shuffled into the chapel supported on either side, his body hunched, his jaw grotesquely thrust forward, his tongue flicking from between cracked lips. At the altar, Marie-Louise forced a smile as she placed her hand in his. The courtiers watched in silence, knowing the truth yet daring not to speak it aloud. Spain's future now depended on a man who seemed barely capable of standing, let alone fathering a dynasty. The wedding was celebrated with fanfare across the empire. But inside the palace, dread coiled tighter. For all the pomp and music, the real question loomed like a shadow over every toast and prayer. Could this marriage ever be consummated? Section 6. The wedding night should have been a moment of triumph, the union of two great houses. Instead, it became a hushed catastrophe. Marie-Louise, barely 17, was led into the royal bedchamber lit with hundreds of candles. The air was heavy with incense and expectation. Courtiers and priests lingered outside, waiting for news that the marriage had been properly sealed. Inside, Charles trembled. His body, twisted and frail, did not respond as a husband's should. His jaw hung slack, his tongue too large for speech, and though he tried to comfort his young bride with fumbling words, they came out as garbled murmurs. Marie-Louise, who had grown up in the glittering French court, forced herself to hide her revulsion. She placed a gentle hand on his arm and whispered, "Do not be afraid, my lord. We will try together." But try as she might, there was nothing to be done. Charles's body refused him. The hours dragged on in humiliating silence. At dawn, the priests waiting outside received no announcement, no celebratory word. Instead, whispers began to seep through the palace. The marriage was unconsummated. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Still no sign of success. Marie-Louise played her part in public, smiling, curtsying, attending court functions, but behind closed doors she wept. Her letters to her family in France, though heavily censored, hinted at despair. "I am treated kindly," she wrote. "Yet I feel as though I have married a child trapped in a man's body. There is no hope of an heir." The Spanish court, however, refused to accept failure. Physicians and apothecaries devised endless remedies. Charles was made to drink concoctions of exotic herbs, ground pearls, and even bull's blood. At one point, a German specialist prescribed powdered stag genitals, claiming it would restore virility. Marie-Louise was subjected to her own humiliations, bitter brews, strange poultices, and invasive examinations to prove her fertility. When all failed, Queen Mariana turned to superstition. She summoned mystics, confessors, and holy men. One insisted Charles was cursed and must sleep beside sacred relics to break the spell. When that failed, she arranged something even more macabre. Her son spent nights in the company of corpses exhumed from royal tombs, saints, bishops, even his own father. The belief was that their holy essence would pass into him, curing his impotence. Imagine it, the King of Spain, drooling and broken, lying stiffly beside the shriveled remains of his ancestors, desperate for a miracle that never came. Year after year, the marriage remained barren. Rumors spread across Europe. Foreign diplomats reported back to their kings with scathing certainty. Charles was incapable, Spain was doomed. Yet, in the midst of her misery, Marie-Louise showed remarkable patience. She treated Charles with gentleness, even kindness, though palace gossip whispered she grew pale and thin from sorrow. Some said she had taken to riding horses recklessly in the palace gardens, throwing herself into danger, as if to feel alive again. 10 years passed. No child came. The pressure mounted. Then, suddenly, tragedy struck. At just 26, Marie-Louise collapsed one afternoon after a ride. Within days, she was dead. The official cause was listed as appendicitis, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered poison, others whispered suicide. Charles was devastated. For all his physical weakness, he had loved her in his own way. In the dark halls of the Escorial, courtiers recalled the king wandering aimlessly, weeping openly, clutching at rosaries and muttering prayers for her soul. But Spain could not wait for grief. An heir was still required. Section 7. The bells of Madrid tolled once more for a royal wedding. This time the bride was Maria Anna of Neuburg, daughter of the Elector Palatine and member of a family famed for extraordinary fertility. Her mother had borne 17 children. Spain's ministers hoped those robust German genes might succeed where all else had failed. Maria Anna entered the marriage with determination. She was practical, intelligent, and well aware of her husband's reputation. Upon first meeting Charles, she forced a polite smile, though her eyes flickered at the sight of him, the protruding jaw, the pale skin, the vacant stare. He shuffled toward her supported by attendants, his body already worn by years of illness. Yet she bowed respectfully. She knew her duty was to the Spanish crown, not to herself. But within weeks she too learned the truth: there would be no heir. Charles's body was a hollow shell of kingship. His attempts at marital duty were clumsy, painful, and fruitless. Court physicians hovered constantly, prescribing ever more bizarre treatments. They brewed potions of crushed gemstones, ground bees' oars, even mercury tonics. Nothing worked. As the months stretched into years, Maria Anna's patience thinned. She began to resent the endless humiliations, the examinations, the whispered blame when no child came. At times she snapped openly, declaring, "I am not the barren one!" Her ladies repeated her words in secret, and soon even the servants spoke of the Queen's bitterness. Meanwhile, Charles deteriorated. His teeth loosened and fell out, leaving him unable to chew even the softened foods prepared specially for him. His hair fell away in uneven clumps, his skin yellowed and sagged. At barely 30, he looked twice his age. Seizures racked his body without warning. Sometimes he would collapse in the throne room itself, foaming at the mouth as horrified courtiers rushed to his side. Worse than the physical decline was the creeping madness. Charles began to mutter of spirits that visited him in the night. He swore he saw ghosts drifting through the corridors of the palace, his dead wife, his ancestors, even demons with clawed hands. At court councils, he would drift into silence, staring at the ceiling as though in a trance. When he spoke again, it was often nonsense, rambling about curses, hexes, and invisible tormentors. The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, spread beyond whispers into official documents. Even ministers began to speak of their king as cursed. Priests and exorcists were summoned. Holy water was sprinkled over the king's bed. Rituals were performed in secret chambers. None of it mattered. Charles remained as he had always been, frail, broken, and incapable of saving the dynasty. Spain's empire, once the richest and most powerful in Europe, was rotting from the inside just as its monarch was. The colonies rebelled more frequently, the treasury ran thin, and foreign powers circled like vultures. And at the center of it all sat a king who could not father a child, could barely walk without aid, and increasingly could not tell reality from visions. By his mid-30s, Charles seemed more ghost than man. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched thin over bone. He drooled constantly, his speech now so garbled that only his closest attendants could interpret his words. Yet Spain clung to him, terrified of what would come when he was gone. Because when Charles II died, the line of Spanish Habsburgs would die with him. Section 8. The end came in the year 1700. Charles, only 38 but aged like an old man, spent his last months confined to bed. His body had collapsed entirely. He could not chew, could not walk, could scarcely breathe without gasping. He lay propped on pillows, his enlarged skull pressing painfully against his spine, his body reduced to skin and bone. 4 days he drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling prayers and pleas. He wept often, asking priests what sins he had committed to deserve such torment. When exorcists came, he submitted willingly, desperate for relief. None came. His body was simply unraveling, cell by cell, under the weight of centuries of inbreeding. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, Charles breathed his last. The bells that rang were not celebratory but mournful. The court, though long prepared, reeled. Spain's last Hapsburg king was gone, and with him, the dynasty itself. But the horror was not finished. His autopsy, performed by royal physicians, became infamous. They cut open the body and recoiled in disgust. His corpse, they wrote, contained Not a single drop of blood. His heart was shrunken, blackened like a peppercorn. His lungs were scarred and rotten, his intestines gangrenous. His body was a landscape of ruin. Most shocking of all, the doctors reported that Charles possessed only one testicle, shriveled and dark as coal. It was the final confirmation of what Europe had long suspected: Spain's king had never been capable of producing an heir. His body was the tomb of his dynasty. Modern scientists, centuries later, would analyze the Hapsburg line and calculate Charles's inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than the child of siblings. His genetic code carried within it two deadly disorders: pituitary deficiency, which stunted his growth and halted puberty, and renal tubular acidosis, which warped his bones and sapped his strength. Added to this was the infamous Hapsburg jaw, a grotesque inheritance of faces marrying faces too similar for too many generations. The result was a man who had lived in constant pain, mocked as cursed when his only crime was birth. His death plunged Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping the continent's balance of power. Today, his portraits hang in museums. Tourists glance at the elongated jaw, the drooping mouth, the eyes heavy with sadness. Most move on without knowing the full story. But those who pause see more than just a royal face. They see the cost of unchecked ambition, of bloodlines twisted in pursuit of power. Charles II of Spain was not cursed by witches. He was cursed by his own ancestry. His life stands as one of history's starkest warnings. When bloodlines are forced into circles, they eventually strangle themselves. And so ended the Spanish Habsburgs, not with assassination, nor rebellion, but with the silent death of a man whose very body carried the doom of his dynasty.